Okay, so we're picking up with chapter 21. The victims should always be arrested first. Remember that we have a situation where you have uh, Jean Valjean being held against his will by Jondrette, who is also Thénardier. You've got Marius that sees it. Marius had already let the police know, but he didn't want to signal for them because of the fact that he didn't want to signal because of the fact that it was Thénardier. And right at the very end of that, Javert comes as the police officer. At nightfall, Javert had posted his men and hidden himself behind the trees on the Rue de la Barrière des Gobelins, which faces the Gorbeau house on the other side of the boulevard. He began by opening his pocket to put in the two young girls charged with watching the approaches to the house, but he only bagged Azelma. As for Éponine, she was not at her post. She had disappeared, and he had not been able to collar her. Then Javert put himself on watch and listened for the agreed signal. The going and coming of the fiacre had worried him very much. At last he became impatient, and sure that there was a nest there, sure of being in luck, having recognized several of the felons who had gone in, he finally decided to go out without waiting for the pistol shot. It will be remembered that he had Marius's pass key. He had come at the right time. The frightened outlaws rushed for the arms they had thrown down anywhere in their attempt to escape. In less than a second, those 7 appalling men were grouped in a posture of defense, one with his poleaxe, another with his key, a third with his club, the others with shears, pliers, and hammers, Thénardier grasping his knife. The Thénardiers seized a huge paving stone which was in the corner by the window, and which her daughters used as a stool. Javert put on his hat again and stepped into the room, his arms folded, his cane under his arm, his sword in its sheath. "Halt!" he said. "You will not leave by the window. You will leave by the door. It's healthier. There are 7 of you, 15 of us. Don't let's scuffle like a bunch of provincials. Let's be nice." Brigonnet took a pistol he had concealed under his blouse and put it into Thénardier's hand, whispering in his ear, "It's Javert. I don't dare shoot at that man, do you?" "Good Lord!" Thénardier muttered. "Well, then, shoot!" Thénardier took the pistol and aimed at Javert. Javert, who was within 3 paces, looked at him steadily and merely said, "Don't go and shoot. It'll misfire." Thénardier pulled the trigger. The pistol misfired. "I told you so," said Javert. Brigonnet threw down his cudgel at Javert's feet. "You're the king of the devils. I give up." "And you?" Javert asked the other cutthroats. They answered, "Me too." Javert replied calmly, "That's it. That's good. Just as I said. You're being nice." "I ask only one thing only," said Brigonnet, that I can have a tobacco when I'm in solitary." "Granted," said Javert, and turning around and calling up behind him, "Come in now." A squad of gendarmes with drawn swords and policemen armed with bludgeons rushed in. They tied up the thugs. The crowd of men, dimly lit by a candle, filled the den with shadow. "Handcuffs on all of them," cried Javert. "Just you come close," cried a voice that was not a man's voice, but nobody would have dared identify as a woman's. The Thénardiers had holed up in a corner of the window embrasure, and it was she who had just bellowed. The policemen and officers fell back. She had thrown off her shawl, but kept on her hat. Her husband, cowering behind her, was almost hidden under the fallen shawl, and she covered him with her body, holding the paving block in both hands above her head with the poise of an Amazon about to hurl a rock. "Watch out!" she cried. They all crowded back toward the hall. A wide space was left in the middle of the room. The Thénardiers cast a glance at the bandits who had allowed themselves to be tied and muttered in a harsh and guttural tone, "Cowards!" Javert smiled and advanced into the open space that the Thénardiers had staked out with her eyes. "Don't come any nearer. Go away," she cried, "or I'll crush you." "What a grenadier!" said Javert. "Mother, you have a beard like a man, but claws like a woman." And he kept walking toward her. The Thénardier, her hair disheveled, raving, braced her legs, bent backward, and heaved the paving stone wildly at Javert's head. Javert ducked, the stone passed over him, hit the wall behind, knocking down a large piece of the plaster, and returned, bounding across the room, which luckily was almost empty, finally stopping at Javert's heels. At that moment Javert reached the Thénardier couple. One of his huge hands fell on the woman's shoulder, and the other on her husband's head. "Handcuffs!" he cried. The policemen returned in a body, and in a few seconds Javert's order was executed. The Thénardiers, completely crushed, looked at her manacled hands and those of her husband, dropped to the floor, and exclaimed with tears in her eyes, "My daughters!" "They've been taken care of," said Javert. Meanwhile, the officers had found the drunken fellow who was asleep behind the door and shook him. He woke up sputtering. "Is it over, Jondrette?" "Yes," answered Javert. The six manacled bandits were on their feet. However, they still retained their spectral appearance. 3 blackened, 3 masked. "Keep on your masks," said Javert. And passing them in review with the eye of a Frederick II on parade at Potsdam, he said to the 3 chimney menders, "Good evening, Brigonale. Good evening, Brujon. Good evening, de Milliards." Then, turning toward the 3 masks, he said to the poleaxe man, "Good evening, Gueulemer," and to the man with the cudgel, "Good evening, Babette," and to the ventriloquist, "Hello, Claquousse." Just then he noticed the bandit's prisoner, who since the entrance of the police had not uttered a word and had his head down. "Untie, monsieur," said Javert, "and don't let anybody out." So saying, he sat down with authority at the table, still bearing the candle and the writing materials, drew a stamped sheet from his pocket, and began his report. When he had written the first lines, purely formulaic and always identical, he raised his hands. "Bring forward the gentleman whom these gentlemen had bound." The officers looked around. "Well," asked Javert, "so where is he?" The bandit's prisoner, Monsieur Leblanc, Monsieur Urbain Faber, the father of Ursula, or the Lark, had disappeared. The door was guarded, but the window was not. As soon as he was untied, and while Javert was writing, he had taken advantage of the disturbance, the tumult, the confusion, the darkness, and a moment where their attention was not fixed on him, to leap out the window. An officer ran to the window and looked down. There was nobody to be seen outside. The rope ladder was still trembling. "The devil!" said Javert between his teeth. That was to be the best one, because Javert did actually recognize that it was Jean Valjean, and remember, he is constantly looking for Jean Valjean, so he wanted to take Jean Valjean into prison in addition to all of the people that the Thénardiers had used to imprison Jean Valjean. Okay, we are going to pick up in the next one. There's a lot we skim because it's a lot of historical stuff. And we will be at lots of skimming. Still looking. Book 2, Eponine 1, The Field of the Lark. Book 2, Eponine 1, The Field of the Lark.